Surveillance camera caught them at 10:02 a.m. this morning. Two teenagers on bicycles, wearing identical white t-shirts with worn backpacks behind them. They rode up to the glass front of the Austin Elite Motors showroom, as if not fully believing they could get in. The bikes were left at the bike parking counter, the boys glanced around, and the glass doors, obeying a sensor, let them into a world where even the air cost more than their clothes. Inside smelled of expensive coffee, leather and ambition. The floor glistened like an exhibition podium, reflecting neon glare from the ceiling. Lacquered counters, muted jazz on the speakers, employees in tight suits the color of night coal. Everything said, "You don't come here to ask, you come here to buy." And certainly not in sneakers and shorts with pockets. Jake was the first to step onto the marble floor. He was a little taller, with a straight back and a look that betrayed not just curiosity but confidence. Ryan paced slightly behind, shuffling from foot to foot, looking around. Not a single logo on their clothes, not a hint of status. Nothing in their hands. No wallet, no phone. Just dreams. A man walked past them with a taut haircut and the keys to a Lamborghini in his hand. The salesman, named Eric, gave a slight shrug and escorted the customer to a cushioned couch, where a latte was waiting in a glass with the car dealership's black logo. Jake, meanwhile, stopped in front of a bright blue hypercar, squinting as if he were considering power rather than price. He leaned over, peered into the side air intake, then ran his finger over the lettering next to the model number. V12? Can't be, must be electric, judging by the air intake, he muttered to himself. Footsteps were heard from behind him. It was Brandon, the head salesman of the salon. He was as charismatic as a TV host and always knew who was a potential customer and who was just dust underfoot. He walked over, didn't hide his smile, crossed his arms over his chest, and stood so that he was obscured by the car. Looking at toys? He tossed with feigned friendliness. Guys, the cars here aren't subscription-based. Even a TikTok blog won't help. Jake didn't respond. Ryan averted his eyes. Brandon continued as if enjoying the spectacle. If you're interested in cars, we have a 2013 Ford Fusion over there in the corner. Not as fast, but it has airbags. Suitable for school kids. Eric, hearing the conversation, looked in their direction and hummed without getting up. There was a young couple standing against the wall, also paying attention to what was going on. The girl grinned, the guy whispered something in her ear. Jake took a step back, silent. Brandon had already turned to the counter, adding as he went, "Guys, if you want to really learn something about cars, come with your parents. Or at least with a bank card." Ryan stepped behind his brother, and the two moved toward the exit. The salesman paid no further attention to them. The security camera recorded the glass doors opening again. The two teens exited as quietly as they had entered. No one saw Jake linger at the entrance for a moment and glance over his shoulder. He wasn't angry. Wasn't surprised. It was like he already knew this was just the beginning. Outside, the wind kicked up dust from the parking lot. The kids got on their bikes but didn't go right away. Ryan asked quietly, "What if we'd been in costumes? Would we have been let in differently?" Jake didn't answer. He just looked toward the bay, where a yacht bobbed on the horizon like a beacon of someone else's life. They drove away. Without a scene. No argument. No loud words. But with a seed that had already begun to germinate, not in resentment but in intent. On camera, it looked like another episode without significance. Two teenagers walked in. Looked at it. Walked away. But in a story no one knew yet, the first page had just opened. On the screen of the service monitor, camera number 7 displayed a broad outline of the entrance area. Jenna Lee noticed it out of the corner of her eye. She wasn't specifically watching, just turning on the tape from last night to see the new Pagani being unloaded. But fast-forwarding a minute, she saw not a forklift but two teenagers. At first she didn't realize why she'd been staring. Then she noticed that one of them, the taller one, stopped at the window, touched the glass with his fingers, through which the outline of the hypercar could be seen. He did it briefly as if by accident. But after that he leaned over, looked up and ran his gaze along the hood. She knew that look. Not the "wow, cool car," not the "I want one of those," but the "why is the air intake like that?" look. Jenna froze. Rewinded. Yes, that's right, the touch on the glass had left the faintest trace. It was almost gone, but it was there. And there was something strangely important about it. It was now 10:05. The doors had already closed behind the boys. They got on their bikes, one of them said something to the other, and both began to slowly pull away. Jenna stood up. She never interfered with the sales department, not her level. She was in charge of customization, technical specifications, and dealing with orders after payment. But something about the two figures made her step out from behind the counter and cross the lobby. The doors opened silently. The street was bright, sunny. The bikes were almost to the parking lot when she raised her voice. Not harsh, not demanding, just firm and clear. "Guys, wait." The boys stopped. One turned his head, the other wrapped his entire body around. The taller one jumped off the bike first. His face remained calm but not closed. He looked straight ahead, not down. As if he wasn't scared, just waiting. She stepped closer. Her shoes clacked softly on the tile, and in her hands was a tablet she hadn't even realized she'd grabbed on the way out. It remained off. Jenna stopped 2 meters away. Didn't extend her hand, didn't introduce herself, she didn't play into those formalities. Just nodded toward the salon. "I saw you were interested in the Huayra Codalunga. Good choice." The boy nodded. Not smiling yet, but not averting his gaze either. The other stood slightly behind, slightly covering the bike with his foot. She continued. "You didn't ask about the price. It was about the air intake. It's rare." He raised an eyebrow slightly, unsure but clearly holding his interest. She realized she'd hit the right spot. Slowly, calmly, as if she were giving a tour, she explained why this particular model had the air intake closer to the side panel and how that affected the cooling of the power plant. The explanation took less than a minute, but at that moment the younger one, the one who had been silent the whole time, stepped forward. He'd obviously realized something. Jenna noticed the change in his expression. Not abruptly, but as if something in him was starting to come together. He was looking at the car differently, not as an object in a shop window, but as an engineering problem. It wasn't trying to impress. Didn't invite them inside, didn't show protocol courtesy. Just talked to them as if they were someone who understood. Or wanted to. Then, as they turned to leave, she took a moment to dig into the side pocket of her bag, pulled out a simple business card and a ballpoint pen. Wrote briefly on the back, "You asked the right questions." Handed it to the older man. He took the card with 2 fingers, looked at it, took his time and said nothing. But the corners of his lips trembled slightly. Almost imperceptibly, but Jenna caught the gesture. They got back on their bikes. But now they were in no hurry to leave. The youngest, Ryan, turned around before pushing himself off the ground. A slight, genuine smile flashed across his face for the first time all day. He didn't say anything, but that look had everything in it. Gratitude, respect, and something akin to hope. When they disappeared around the corner, Jenna stayed where she was for a few seconds longer. Then she slowly turned around, walked back into the salon, and walked over to the counter where Brandon was telling the TikTok brothers' story to the 2 interns. She didn't say anything. Just put the clipboard on the desk, walked back to her office and closed the door behind her. There was a single item on the table, the same business card as everyone else in the salon, only handwritten. Jenna looked at her copy and smiled faintly. That inscription seemed to be no accident today. The house where the Addams family lived was not like a modern mansion with glossy facades and marble columns. It stood alone on a hill overhanging the bay, where the waves echoed muffledly against the rocks at the foot. It had once been a monastery with high windows, vaulted ceilings, massive doors and long corridors where silence sounded like organ music. Now 3 people lived here, a father and 2 sons. But within these walls, despite the soft armchairs, warm lighting and rare elements of modern comfort, there was still a silence that made you think before you spoke. The library was the heart of the house. A large, elongated room overlooking the ocean. Shelves to the ceiling, sparse globes and antique brass frames, a black walnut table where sermons had once been written. Now that table was littered with books on architecture, investment fund reports, and maps of Northern California. This was not a place to talk, it was a place to think. The door opened without a creak. Jake was the first to enter. He didn't look up, he already knew his father would be here. Ryan followed, a little slower, looking back at the book bindings as if afraid to disturb the air. Mark Adams sat in a chair by the window, facing the glass where the ferry was slowly sailing away beyond the sea. His hands rested on the armrests, his gaze fixed but not vacant. Jake walked over to the table without sitting down. From his shorts pocket he pulled a business card. He turned it upside down and placed it carefully in the center of the table. The paper crunched slightly on contact with the wood. He didn't say anything. Mark didn't move immediately. For a few seconds it was as if he hadn't heard or didn't want to interrupt the thought. Then he rose slowly, walked over to the desk, picked up a business card. He read it. Smiled at the corner of his lips. Turned to Ryan. He stood a little ways away, shoulders tense and eyes full of questions. Mark glanced at the fireplace that had been turned off, tilted his head to the side, and said only one thing, "Turn it on." Ryan nodded, walked over to a panel against the wall. A second later, the first flame flickered in the fireplace niche, not loud but alive, like a reminder that the house could warm. Mark sat back down but now facing his sons. He didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask them to tell him who had hurt them. He looked at them for a long time as if studying what had changed. Then he said quietly without pathos, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Jake stood with his back straight just as he had in the parlor. Ryan lowered his head a little but not out of shame. More from the fact that there was too much he wanted to understand at once. His father handed the card back to him and it lay on the table again. He ran his finger over it. His voice was calm. "You weren't recognized not because you were inconspicuous. It's because people most often look over the top, not inward." The room grew even quieter if such a thing was possible. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed to have died down. Outside the window, the ferry was sliding across the horizon, becoming a white blur against the evening sky. Mark looked at it and said suddenly, almost in a whisper, "Even ships remember where they've sailed from. And who's waving at them." The phrase hung in the air like a seal on a letter that hadn't been opened yet. Jake lowered his gaze to the card. He didn't answer anything. Ryan sat on the edge of the couch, silent but closer to his father. The stone in his chest that he'd returned from the car dealership with felt a little lighter. Mark hadn't said a word about what he was going to do. Had made no plans. Didn't promise payback. His silence wasn't inaction, it was observation. He was not a man who reacted in haste. He only acted when he fully understood. That night dinner was held in the old refectory where the monks had once prayed. Light fell from bronze lamps and on the table was simple food, no frills. The father didn't ask how the day had gone. The sons were not the first to start a conversation. But there was already more trust in their silence than 100 words. Ryan ate everything on his plate for the first time in days. Jake took a long look out the window, where the ferry had disappeared into the sunset. But there was still a trace of it in the water. Dawn began slowly in Austin. The city was still asleep, but the streets were beginning to take shape in the dim orange light of the street lamps, in the murky reflections on the morning dewdrops, in the barely perceptible vibration of the air. The front of the Austin Elite Motors dealership was empty. The black asphalt of the parking lot glistened with condensation, and the display windows were silent in the pre-dawn stillness. A surveillance camera mounted above the entrance clicked quietly, capturing traffic on the road. At exactly 7:59, 2 cars stopped in front of the building. Not just any cars, two-colored, matte, with subdued lighting under the sills, they looked as if they had arrived not from the road, but from the catwalk of the future. Electric Lucid Sapphire, each a concept, which are not yet on public sale. One was silver blue, the other graphite black with copper accents. No sound of the engine, just the rustle of tires on tile. The front door of the silver Lucid opened first. A man in a long coat the color of wet sand stepped out of the car. He wore no logos, no tie, no jewelry. Just the coat, gloves, and a leather folder in his left hand. His steps were measured like a man in no hurry to prove a point. Behind him, synchronously, the doors of the second car opened. 2 teenagers stepped out of it, wearing the same white t-shirts and cargo shorts as the day before. Jake and Ryan. They carried across the parking lot, not like kids who'd been brought in to show off, but like those who'd returned to a place where they were owed something. Jenna approached the entrance as the Lucid doors were just beginning to open. She held a paper cup of coffee in her hand, her other hand opening the side door of the service entrance. But when she saw the figure of Mark Adams, she stopped. Her eyes widened. Not from fear, but from a momentary realization. This man hadn't just come to buy. He had come to make a statement. Mark nodded at her, his face unchanged. His gaze slid over her figure, then back to the front doors. He was the first through the automatic casements. The cameras inside clicked. The electronic system noted, a VIP had entered. Except the system didn't know who he was. It recorded footsteps, head movements, but it didn't understand what was going on. The employees behind the counter exchanged glances. The receptionist looked up from the screen. The salespeople in the seats froze. One of them, Brandon, slowly put down his glass of energy drink. His face went pale, as if he recognized the silhouette before his brain even had time to recognize it. Jenna followed, but stopped in the shadows. Mark walked up to the reception desk and stopped exactly where his sons had stood yesterday. Without raising his voice, calmly said, "Please bring in a staff member who showed professionalism and respect for my children yesterday." The receptionist stiffened. Her lips began to form a name, but she didn't know who he meant. Brandon stepped forward. "It's probably me, sir," he began, but Mark didn't even look in his direction. Only said, "No. Not you." Silence hung in the hall like the shadow of a rain cloud. Everyone waited for the thunder to boom, for the dismissals to go, for the play to happen. But instead, Mark placed a leather folder on the counter, opened it and pulled out a single sheet. On it were the technical specifications for the hypercar Codalunga, and at the bottom was the amount of the prepayment. "Put this in Lisa Carter's name," he said. "Full customization, as my oldest son pointed out. Color, interior, ventilation. Everything." Next to it was a check with the amount already put in. Not $1 million, a little less, but without further ado. The staff froze. This was not a bot show, but the silence of power. Fox stood nearby, stunned, almost unable to believe this was happening before her eyes. Mark turned to her and said, already in person, "You didn't see them as buyers. But you saw them as people. You realized they didn't come to buy. They came to understand. And that was enough." Cameras captured the whole scene, but only people could understand what it meant. Mark picked up a copy of the order, nodded to his sons. They moved after him. No screams, no applause, no shocked voices. Just the cold air, the dawn, and footsteps on the glossy floor, which now bore the marks of the very road on which one returns with dignity. The sun was already high when the car showroom began to slowly return to its usual rhythm. But the familiar was gone. Something had shifted. Unknowingly but irreversibly. Brandon stood at his desk, as if in the shadow of his own reflection. Yesterday he had seemed confident, almost brilliant. Today he was silent and hunched. The manager asked him to come into the office without public explanation. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. The cameras recorded him walking out, no folder, no words, no attempt to justify himself. He didn't know who the man in the coat was, but he realized one thing. His time here was over. At the receptionist's desk, Lisa Carter was still standing with papers in her hands. Her co-workers cast passing glances at her, now full of cautious respect rather than condescension. Someone whispered, "Did you know who they were?" She shook her head. It wasn't knowledge but intuition. Not guessing but choosing. A new email flashed on the screen of her office laptop. The sender was with an Italian domain. The headline was Programma di Formazione Avanzata. The text was an official invitation to take an internship at Pagani's headquarters in Medina. Paid, with the possibility of staying on permanently. At the bottom was the signature of the head of the personnel department and a note, on the personal recommendation of one of the owners of the company. Lisa covered the screen with her palm. She hadn't asked for it. Didn't expect it. Just did what she felt was right. Meanwhile, in front of the building, near the same bike parking lots where it all started, 2 boys were standing in front of the building. Again in t-shirts. Again in shorts. Only now they didn't look lost. Or naive. They stood in silence, looking at the window, behind which the very hypercar they had discussed the day before was shimmering blue. But they didn't come any closer. Didn't pose. Didn't show off their victory. This was not their trophy. It was a chapter they had turned. One of the guards, a tall man in a gray uniform, came half a step toward them, uncertain, almost embarrassed. He looked at Jake and asked as if he himself doubted whether he should, "Are you really Mark Donovan's sons?" Jake turned. At first he wanted to nod. But then, glancing at his brother, he answered quietly, "No. We're his students." And that was it. No more explanations. He got on his bike, slung his backpack over his shoulder, checked the brakes. Ryan followed suit. The employees inside, still standing at the counter, watched through the glass. No one came out. No one clapped. But no one grinned either. All that remained was silence. And respect. Not for the name. For the behavior. The lucid cars parked out front remained standing still. They were not the means of a spectacular exit. They were silent witnesses. Like the camera on the front, which was still recording but no longer recording customers and merchandise movement, but documenting an event no one would forget. By the time the boys turned the corner and disappeared from sight, many inside had already returned to their duties. Sales, phone calls, coffee was all back. Only the air was different. The manager held a meeting. A short one. No emotion. He just reminded us that respect is not a bonus but a prerequisite. He didn't name anyone. But everyone understood. At home, in the library overlooking the bay, Mark Donovan was once again sitting in a chair by the window. On the desk, a stack of books and a few new business cards. He hadn't checked his mail. Didn't call the salon. He knew it was done. His lesson was not in punishment but in setting the stage. Money can silence. Attitude can change the rules. But only behavior can retrain attitudes. He opened a book, Not about business, not about the market, but about ship navigation. On the cover was an ancient chart with current lines. Mark looked at it and smiled. Because he realized that the real power wasn't in shouting. It's about showing up when others are sure you're gone. And leave behind not noise but silence. The very silence in which it suddenly becomes clear that everything was not in vain. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.